Well, welcome back to our review topics here. Tonight's review topic is called Quadratic Inequalities. And these take a little bit of work, so stick with me. It's not very difficult, but like I said, it takes a little bit of work. We can't just jump to the answer right away. So let me just review what the word inequality means. Equal sign would be an equality. Therefore, an inequality is either you're less than or equal to, or you're greater than or equal to. These are inequalities, basically in meaning not equal. They're inequalities. They're unequal, not equal. So I just want to be clear how you read these. The side you see first is what you're going to describe. This end is small, this end is great. So since this end is smaller, we would say this is the less than. This line underneath means less than or equal to. Obviously this is my greater than, and then my greater than or equal to. Okay, so let's just make sure we can read these carefully. Other things to keep in mind is whether that we're talking solid or open circles. If you see the solid line underneath, solid line means solid circle. They kind of go together. Solid line, solid circle. If you don't see it, it's a nice open circle. When we talk graphing, I would say this would be a dashed line, whereas a solid line would be a solid line. Dashed if you don't have it, solid line, make the solid line. And then just to quickly review the word quadratic. Okay, we have the quadratic equation, the quadratic formula. Basically, that quadratic is telling us that we have an x squared term. Okay, whether it's x squared minus 36 or x squared whatever, we have an x squared term, which means that our shape makes a parabola. If our x squared is positive, it's an upward-facing parabola, and if our x squared is negative, it's a downward-facing parabola. But that squared tells us the quadratic. So let's go ahead and dive into a few examples. These are called quadratic inequalities. That means they are in the form of a quadratic equation, which of course is ax squared plus bx plus c. Okay, so basically they have a squared in them. That's what makes it quadratic. So before you can factor, of course, our goal is to make sure that we are greater than or less than, whatever we are, to 0. So once that holds true, we can quickly factor. So I would say x minus 4 and x plus 3. Okay, remember, add, multiply. Tee it up. And I'm just going to pretend this is equal to for now. I'm not saying greater than, I'm not saying less than. I'm just pretending it says equal to. So I get x equals 4 and x equals negative 3. Now we're going to make a number line for each one of these. Obviously in order, negative 3 to 4. And then I need to determine whether I have that open or closed circle. And I hope you would agree that this right here is telling me open circle because there's not that solid line underneath. And now you have to play this game on where do you shade. And we're going to pick some test points. Basically, you can test anybody bigger than 4, anybody between negative 3 and 4, and anybody smaller than negative 3. So I'm going to write my test points down below. I'm going to test negative 5 here. I'm going to test 0 between those two numbers, and I'm going to test positive 5 here. Now, all I'm testing to see is whether I get a positive or a negative answer. Okay, that's all I'm doing. Do I get a positive or negative? So let's start with the number 5. If I plug 5 back into this original here, do I get a positive or a negative? Well, I'm going to get 25 minus 5 minus 12. Okay, and clearly 25 minus 5 is 20, minus 12 is 8. I get a positive number, so I'm going to put a plus sign here. I'm going to do the same thing with 0. I'm going to get 0 squared minus 0 minus 12. This time that's telling me I'm going to get a negative number. And then I'm going to do the same thing with negative 5. Negative 5 squared is positive 25, minus a negative makes that a plus 5 minus 12. That is going to be a positive number. Now once I've done that, I just have to go back and read. What do I want to be to 0? And just read this. You want to be greater than 0. Again, I see the big N first. That means greater than 0. If you're greater than 0, are you a positive number or are you a negative number? Clearly, greater than 0 is positive. If you don't believe me, here's 0 on a number line. Positive numbers are to the right that are bigger than 0, negative numbers are to the left. So I'm going to shade where I am positive, where I put my plus signs. Okay, then I'm just going to state my inequality. If I go in two directions, I need to use the word or. Basically, you can walk this way, or you can walk this way. I'm going to say all my x values are less than -3, or all my x values are greater than 4. Notice I'm starting with x both times, and I'm just describing less than or greater than. Let's try another one. Number 2, x squared plus 8x plus 7 is greater than or equal to 0. So the first thing that you have to check is, before you can factor, you have to be equal to 0, which we are. So let's go ahead and factor. I would say this is add multiply. Start with your multiplying. I gotta be 7 and 1. This sign tells me that they're the same, plus plus. Tee it up. I should get x equals -7 and x equals -1. Alright, let's throw those on a number line. Smaller to larger, so -7, -1. Okay, go ahead and just write your test points down. Who are you going to test? I would say -8 here. A number between -1 and 7, maybe -2. And a number bigger than -1, I'm going to use 0 as my test point. Okay, now again, all you're doing is telling me whether you get a positive or a negative. That's all I'm looking for. When you plug this in, you get a positive or a negative. Well, I'm going to get 0 squared plus 0 plus 7. I would definitely say that's a positive. -2 squared is 4 minus 16 plus 7. 4 minus 16 is -12 plus 7 is definitely a negative. And -8 squared is 64 minus 64 plus 7 is definitely a positive. Okay, now, it's not a guess. Go back and read what this says. What do you want to be to 0? Do you see bigger than or less than? I see greater than. And if I'm greater than 0, if you're 0 and I'm greater than 0, that's a what type of number? Positive. So I'm going to shade where I put a plus sign, which is this way and this way. The last thing I got sloppy on is whether I want an open or closed circle. Because it's an equal to, of course we want that to be a closed circle. Alright, now I just have to write my answer down. Again, I'm going in two directions, so I'm going to use the word or. I can say my x values are less than -7, or my x values are greater than -1. Again, just picture where you can walk. If you were walking on this number line, you could walk this way, anywhere less than -7, or you could walk any way greater than -1. Alright, x squared minus 25 is less than 0. So I'm just quickly checking to make sure it says something to 0. You always got to be at 0 first. And now I can go ahead and factor, so why don't you pause it, factor it on your own, tee it up, and get your two solutions. Hopefully you had positive and -5 as well. I'm going to go ahead and stick these on a number line, -5 and +5. Let's decide whether right off the bat we want open or closed circles. What are you thinking? Hopefully you're saying open circles, no line underneath. Now I just have to determine where to shade, and I'm simply going to test some points. On this side I would test -6. Between -5 and +5 is a nice safe 0, or 1 or 2, doesn't matter. And I'm going to test, I don't know, maybe 10 on this side. Okay, just somebody bigger than 5. So let's plug them back in. If I plug in 10, that's 100 minus 25, which hopefully is obviously a positive. Notice I don't care what it is, I just know that it's positive. If I test 0, I get 0 squared, which is 0 minus 25, which is clearly a negative. If I plug in -6, that's 36 minus 25, which is clearly a positive. Okay, now it's not a guessing game. You go back and you read what it says. What do you want to be to 0? Well, what symbol do you have to 0? This symbol is less than. So you just say, if you're less than 0, are you a positive or a negative number? And if you get stuck, just picture, a little basic sign chart. If 0's in the middle, and you're less than 0, you are a negative number. So I'm going to shade where I put the negative sign. Now, let's go ahead and write the answer to our inequality. This one's a little different from those previous ones. Notice that my x values, it's not an or this time. I'm not going this way or this way. I'm in between these two numbers. So I'm literally going to put my x in between the two numbers. Okay, it's not this way or this way, it's right in the middle. Now just use common sense for this symbol. Watch how easy this is. Negative 5 is what to positive 5? Would you say less than or greater than? Negative 5 is clearly less than positive 5. That means those two symbols are going to go in the same direction. Just want to make a note that they should never change direction. You should not have two different directions in one answer. That is 100% incorrect. Okay, we're going to make sure they always go in the same direction. And just common sense, negative 5 is less than positive 5. All right, this time we want to solve this equation graphically, so not on a number line, but actually on a graph. So let's go ahead and draw ourselves an x and y axes. Now there's several things we have to consider here. First and foremost, before you just go ahead and draw a line, you have to determine whether it's going to be dashed versus solid. Okay, so that's one question to answer, dashed versus solid. So either you know what this equation looks like or you can throw it in your calculator. X squared tells me it's a parabola. The minus 1 tells me to shift it down 1. Okay, so I know basically I'm drawing a parabola and I'm moving it down 1. Now, do I want dashed or solid? Well, would you draw an open or a closed circle based off this? Solid line, closed circle, which tells me solid graph. So I'm going to graph a nice solid parabola. Okay, now I have to determine if I'm going to shade basically inside the parabola or outside the parabola. And it's very simple. The next thing we're going to do is test a point. Alright, so you can pick your favorite point in the world. It doesn't matter to me. You just can't pick somebody actually on the curve. Okay, so to me, an obvious point would be to test like 0, 0. That's clearly not on the curve. So I'm going to test 0, 0. Basically, if I have the point 0, 0, x is 0 and y is 0. So I'm just going to plug those into my equation. So I would get 0 is greater than or equal to 0 squared minus 1. 0 is greater than or equal to negative 1. Would you agree or disagree with that? Is 0 bigger than negative 1? Well, again, if you can't think of that for some reason, here's 0, here's negative 1. If you're bigger, you're to the right. So 0 definitely is bigger than negative 1. Since that's true, basically that means I'm going to shade where this point is, which means I am shading inside this parabola. And that is my final answer. So things to consider is whether you want a dashed versus solid function, and then test a point and shade where it's true. So maybe let's just add another note here. We're going to shade where it's true. All right, the next equation, y is less than x squared minus 7x plus 10. I want you to solve this one graphically as well. So let's talk about the two things we need to consider. Are we going to have a solid versus dashed line? And what's going through your head right now? Take a look at this symbol. Are you saying solid versus dashed? All right. I would probably factor it and get a nice picture or graph it on your calculator. And then let's test a point to see where to shade. So why don't you pause it, try it on your own, and we'll see if we get the same thing. So I quickly factored mine to find the roots. Okay, and this is where my parabola is going to cross the x-axis. I didn't have my calculator handy, so this is what I'm using. So I know it's going to hit at 2 and 5. Those are the roots of my parabola. Okay, because it's a positive x squared, that means that parabola is going to open upward, so hopefully that's what it looked like on your calculator. And before I actually draw it, did I say solid or dashed? What were you thinking here? Hopefully you said dashed. So I'm going to draw in a nice dashed parabola. Okay, I'm going to pick a point to test that is just not on the parabola. For example, maybe I'll test the point 1, 2, 3, 4, 0. Okay, maybe I'm going to use this as my test point, 4, 0. So I'm plugging 0 into the y's and 4 into the x's. So I'm going to get 0 is less than 4 squared is 16 minus 28 plus 10. So 0 is less than negative 2. True or false? Here's 0. Here's negative 2. Is 0 smaller than negative 2? I would definitely say no. That means I'm not going to shade there. So basically, because this is inside my parabola, I am not shading inside. That tells me I have to shade outside my parabola. And there you have it. Alright, well, we've made it to that time where we're looking for the last one of the night here, and we'll be looking for it in your notebook tomorrow. I just want to be clear, I want you to solve this one algebraically, so not graphically. I want this one in the end on a number line, not a graph of it. So similar to what we were doing in the beginning of the notes there. So we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Have a great night.